So in light of these, the panel that we have prepared today will take the floor, each panelist will take the floor 5 minutes. And they will be exploring two main questions. How the concept of platform governance provides explanatory power and where it fails to do so. And when applied to the academic and policy discourse in countries and languages that are not the US, the European or the American, mostly in English, right? And the second question is how platform governance actually functions in various regions from a policy perspective, and to what extent the realities of platform governance differ when we look at it from different realities and different imaginings. So the speakers will be in this order: Eugenia Siapera from University College of Dublin, who will be talking about Digital Service Act as a policing regime for platforms. It will be followed by Tomiwa Illori from Pretoria, South Africa, who will be focused on Ethiopia and Nigeria. Ariadna Matamoros Fernández, Queensland University of Technology, Australia, who will be focused on the UK's draft online safety bill and lawful online harms. That was a bracket. And the panel will be closed by Yong, Simon Fraser University in Canada, who will be focused on platform governance in Netflix era. Following our panelists, our colleague Pranav Bidare will be moderating a discussion, and hopefully there will be some questions from the audience. So if this is all, Eugenia, I think Eugenia is in the room. I can see you right now, but Eugenia, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Paloma, and hello to everyone. It's around 20 past 10 in Greece, which is where I am at the moment. So I hope I'm still lucid. If I'm not, please, by all means, interrupt me and let me know. But what I want to do today is basically to offer a very high-level summary of the Digital Services Act, which is the new policy instrument that the European Union has put in place. Actually, as we speak, very recently, it became it was formalized. So I want to summarize the DSA by saying that my main argument is basically that it constitutes a governance instrument that creates or perhaps reinforces a certain understanding of digital platforms, their users and their own national governments. And because of the key role of the European Union in leading policy in the digital domain, in contrast with, for example, the United States, where policy is primarily understood as lifting barriers to trade. So because of this reason, this policy instrument sets the pace for future policy, as we have seen happening with GDPR, because it is easier for other nations to emulate existing policies, and also because it makes sense for platforms to then operate in a harmonized manner across the world. It is also very important to kind of like contextualize the DSA in terms of the current geopolitics. So the European Union understands itself in contrast to and as positioned in between the United States on the one hand and China on the other hand, in terms of what it wants to do within the tech domain. But nevertheless, the focus is very much on economy, innovation, and what the European Union refers to as fundamental rights, but which I want to argue mainly refer to the right of freedom of expression. So the key concern for the DSA was basically to protect, remove barriers to allow platforms to trade within the European Union, but also to protect citizens, as well as safeguarding certain key European values, not only pivotally or primarily freedom of expression, but not only this, also including democracy and the quality of information and the health of the public sphere. In order to create this kind of like instrument to regulate all platforms, they developed a set of definitions that are applicable to different kinds of or different types of platforms, including intermediary services that provide internet access, hosting services, which are basically cloud services, online platforms which bring together sellers and consumers, app stores, collaborative economy platforms, and some social media platforms, and then very large online platforms, which are basically those that monopolize the current digital public sphere: Meta, Google, Twitter, and TikTok. So the DSA creates a new set of obligations, and out of these I will focus on mainly three that I consider to be key because they set a very clear paradigm of governance. So firstly, the first obligation is that for transparency. The second obligation is to cooperate with national authorities. And the third obligation is to provide due account of fundamental rights within terms of services. So these kind of like cover the triptych of this kind of like relationship between platforms, nation states, and users. So this is the kind of like the triangle of how platforms and other kind of like actors are involved. So to begin with, then, platforms need to provide clear explanations on how they operate internally, including some at least high-level explanations of how their algorithms work. So note here that the DSA considers transparency on its own a good enough measure without any requirements. For example, that algorithms do not rely on demographic characteristics, or that algorithms do not use sensitive personal data to target users. Transparency is enough, as far the obligation of transparency is enough as far as the DSA is concerned. Secondly, we see national governments trying to assert control over platforms, which has been the key issue of contention as nation states saw their sovereignty undermined ostensibly because of platforms. Needless to say that platforms are already seeing this as a business opportunity, since they can now sell sovereignty solutions to nations, especially when it comes to cloud services. For example, we saw today an announcement by Microsoft Cloud for Sovereignty. This is its literal name, which is seen as a new solution for public service customers. Thirdly, in terms of the fundamental rights, terms of service should consider fundamental rights, and chief between these rights is the freedom of expression. So while I consider this a commendable move, it's always very important to kind of like safeguard freedom of expression. There is no reference to contradictory principles, for example, between freedom of speech and protection of vulnerable groups, and no further clarity as to how this practice, this kind of like these tensions are practically resolved. And the reason for this is we see that that it is left to platforms to determine the kind of balance they want to strike, or to national governments to say that this is what we require for our country. So in all, I consider the DSA as a soft touch policy instrument that doesn't fundamentally alter the relation between users, platforms, and states, but slightly reconfigures it in ways that signal a assertion of state primacy and consumer rights. From the platform's point of view, the requirements or new obligations, I believe, can be met, at least by the very large platforms, in what seems to be a very straightforward manner, because they involve practices that are already in place. For example, trusted flaggers, transparency reports, some measures of accountability, takedown processes, complaints procedures, and so forth. So this kind of instrument can also be seen as a foreign policy tool that signals to other states outside the EU policy possibilities that can be then emulated or selected as appropriate. There is no challenge in terms of the fundamental understandings, and no challenge in particular of practices that may end compromising the very rights that the EU is looking to protect when it comes to national sovereignty, to user protection, to diversity of views, plurality of information, and in general, the health of the public sphere. For this reason, I think that despite the positive intentions and engaged practices, public consultations, and so on that inform the DSA, it does not seem to me to pose any fundamental challenges to platform monopolies or to the existing state of affairs, but rather it formalizes and entrenches currently dominant understandings. For example, that platforms must be allowed to operate commercially in a more or less unhindered manner, albeit with some added bureaucracy. And moreover, given the status of the EU as a trendsetter in digital policy, such views and ideas are creating a kind of path dependence with other policy initiatives following along similar lines. So I'll stop here and maybe we can follow some of these points later on in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eugenia. Thank you. Really interesting points that we will follow up, certainly. Before, during the introduction, I made a mistake and I escaped Divyansha Sehgal from the Center for Internet and Society in India, and she is the next speaker. She will be talking about policy focus on India. So, Divyansha, apologies, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Paloma. All right, I want to talk a little bit about tech policy, the policy sphere in India, but I'm going to preface this with saying that a lot of platform governance conversations and a lot of tech accountability conversations end up positioning governments and legislations as a counterbalance to the powers of big tech platforms. But this isn't usually feasible in countries that are not global north countries, not because the problems of big tech don't exist here, but because of how the infrastructures are built and because of a lot of legislative paternalism. And this is especially true for India. So for us, when we're talking about intermediaries, we keep our intermediaries fairly broad. So there are a bunch of labor platforms, there's internet service providers, social media, all of the different items as you would think of as intermediaries. And they have certain obligations that they do need to follow from the IT Act, which are around keeping information in the manner that has been prescribed by the government. They have to intercept, monitor, and decrypt any information if asked by the government. But if we talk more specifically about social media platforms, content takedown and safe harbor rules are more important to know. So we have a notice and takedown regime in India, which is mostly outlined by Section 69A of the Act, under which the government can send orders to intermediaries to take down content that falls under any of basically that content that is against sovereignty and integrity of India, defense of India, security of state, friendly relations with foreign states, etc., which essentially give the executive a broad powers for content takedown that it does. It has been using very liberally over the last few years. The orders themselves need to go to an intermediary, which is supposed to be confidential. So we as researchers and civil society organizations don't usually know what gets blocked by the government unless it gets picked up by popular media. This only happens if this content that has been blocked has a large enough following for it to reach the level of virality. Creators will not usually get to know of these orders and will usually understand that their content has been taken down when they're informed by their users. There is supposed to be a hearing process attached to this, plus a review committee to review these orders, but as far as we know, this does not happen in practice. There is also a safe harbor provision which allows intermediaries to avoid liability for third-party content, but it is dependent on cooperation with the government and following all of the rules that have been laid down. So all of these rules were laid down in the year 2000. However, there were additional amendments that took place last year in 2021, which set up some more stricter requirements. So it defined a significant social media intermediary for the first time as a different class of intermediary. These significant social media intermediaries had to have a local compliance officer who sits in India and is accountable to the government. They added traceability requirements to identify the first originator of a message, presumably to tackle issues of misinformation. How that would work is still an open question. the rules have asked intermediaries to introduce technical measures to identify child sexual abuse content or content that's already been blocked by a government takedown order. They've also introduced redressal mechanisms where users can challenge takedown orders by the intermediaries, and they must be responded to within 15 days by said intermediary. They have not said anything about takedowns that have been conducted by the government. There are further proposed amendments to these grievance redressal rules so that if a user is unhappy with the decision of the intermediary, they can approach a grievance appellate committee, which can then challenge these decisions. The makeup of this committee has not been specified, and we think that it's going to be the executive. It's going to be executive driven, and which gives them more power to influence internal company policy. Essentially, a lot of regulation that we've seen in this space tends to be rules that the government hopes to exert more control over citizens on how they can and cannot behave online and what they can and cannot see. So while the problems that we will be pointing out around the issues of big tech are present, we do have much more concerns around threats to freedom of speech by the government itself. And yeah, I think I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. We will pick up on some of the issues as well later on. Our next speaker should be Tomiwa Illori from the University of Pretoria. Tomiwa, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Paloma. And I've listened carefully to the previous speakers. And while I see quite a lot of similarities with respect to the last speaker on what is happening in India and what is also happening in most African countries, I see that it is almost polar opposites as to what is happening in within the EU, especially with the Digital Service Act. And one of the basic difference that I see, especially from Europe, for example, is that you don't find countries band together regionally to find common paths with respect to or agreeing to a set of rules as they're currently doing in Europe. Rather, what you see most African countries, and as the previous speaker rightly, highlighted India, of government. Earlier on, Eugenia had mentioned like 3 sets of actors that actually caught my attention, which are platforms, nation state, and users. And that is somehow how I've also been thinking through this panel session, because mainly it's sort of, it is how one can try to explain platform governance power in the region. And what do I mean by that? Most of the time, platforms, especially when it comes to African countries, treat most African countries as, especially when it comes to content regulation or governance, we usually are the last, ones to get any. I reference that claim, with the evidence in Ethiopia about the conflict situation there and how some social media platform has been used to foment and stir up rife and hate speech in Ethiopia, and and that also has continued also in other African countries, especially during elections or during a major political event, where platforms have been found wanting because, oftentimes they do not understand the context. So I see, in my view, I usually see platforms as one of the most proximate regulatory governance actor when it comes to content that should stay up or offline. But also, I'm also very wary of how governments are also trying in some way to reclaim their traditional powers of using laws to regulate this content. And you can see example in Ethiopia, and you can see example in Nigeria. And that specific dynamics is a little bit, complex in the sense that when you say governments should not use their traditional powers to regulate content, what you're indirectly saying is that they should allow online harms, which unfortunately do have offline effects, continue to fester on social media platforms. And here we are having social media platforms not paying enough attention to the contextual issues in order to be able to rightly and properly regulate these harms. So in my language, they say when two elephants fight, it is usually the grass that suffers. And you see in this conversation, a particular, and in my view, the most important actor does not feature, which is the user. So oftentimes it is the user's rights that suffer for this misconception over broad laws, over regulation by social media platforms, especially from the African context. And for example, I'll give an example of when, there was a particular, major protest in Nigeria, I think 2 years ago. And it was a legitimate protest, political protest under the law. And social media, I think Facebook erroneously started censoring messages from this platform, thereby watering down the effect of the protest and giving armory to the state to clamp down on protesters. And this is also government that have constantly used, laws that have deep colonial connotative influence to limit the online space. And for those who may not, understand what that means, it means that laws that have been enforced during the colonial era, the legal culture of repression, of vague regulation of, the freedom of expression space are now being transplanted into hard laws. You now begin to find, laws or provisions in old laws like criminalization of publication of false information, finding its ways into new cybercrime laws. So it is these laws that the government, the state uses to regulate the online space. So you see that on both sides of the divide, both on the government and on the platform, the typical African user is asphyxiated. He or she really has the opportunity to, advocate for him or herself. But I also don't want to permanently paint a gloom picture. Why is because the line to freedom, or the route or road to freedom, is usually not straightforward. So, but because, and I say that because civil society, other social justice organizations have been trying to seek, aside from putting pressure on social media platforms and, being part of stakeholder conversations on these issues, they are also trying to seek, legal advocacy means. For example, I don't know if you're aware that Twitter was banned in Nigeria in 2021, June 2021 to be precise, and the ban was lifted just January this year. And as a result of that, a case was filed in court, and which, even though not in the Nigerian court, but it was in the sub-regional court, the ECOWAS court, and the plaintiffs won, and the court ruled that, the Nigerian government was wrong for restricting Twitter access to Nigerians. So these are some of the wins. They might not be major because of the political role that Nigeria plays in the sub-region. The effect of that judgment might not be weighty compared to whether it was a national judicial system that made that pronouncement. But nonetheless, it signals to the Nigerian government and possibly to other African countries that blanket restrictions or specific bans of social media platforms in order to support a claim, which is unfounded anyway, of stopping online arms on social media platforms really does not hold water, especially with respect to that judgment. So in my view, when we try to explain platform governance power, especially from the African context, and this is me now, because I still, part of the reason why I'm also very interested in working in this space is because I strongly believe that there's a future where the explanatory power for platform governance will be resituated back in the average user. Right now, it is not the case. What we have are laws by nation state, eye-handedness by social media platforms that continue to suppress and snuff out freedoms online. But like I said, I look forward to not just a global system of rules and enforcement and implementation, but also contextually relevant system of rules that at the end of the day will be democratic enough to place the average African user in the midst of this explanatory power. So that would be my contribution. I'd like to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. I'm getting increasingly excited as the arguments are building up. From Eugenia's participation, where we were talking about how somehow the Digital Act does not alter and moving to Divyansha about this government versus platform does not compete. Tomiwa, like how colonial laws are being adopted on platforms. And now it is the turn of Ariadna Matamoros Fernández. Ariadna, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot. So I'm going to discuss some work that I've been doing with my colleague Luisa Bartolo at QUT on this emerging online safety regulation in Europe and how procedural accountability frameworks such as those seen in the UK's draft online safety bill could incentivize platforms to better conceptualize and respond to online harms. So I've just listened to the critique that Eugenia has done in her speech and my other colleagues, and this is a bit of a provocation, like my intervention today, but it's just to see whether this kind of new regulations, if done in consultations with advocacy groups, could open the door to improve platform governance in a way. So I'll start my provocation, and my provocation is that there's a possibility to reimagine the scope and definition of lawful online harms within this emerging online safety regulation. And I say lawful online harms, the illegal harms and how to define them, it's another whole question, but I want to focus on lawful online harms because some jurisdictions that are passing new online safety regulations, such as the UK, want to regulate not only this illegal conduct and content that causes harm, but also legal but harmful content, such as abuse directed at adults that falls below criminal thresholds or self-harm content. And as a result, a number of concerned critics have called for a retreat to narrow legal definitions of harm in this emerging internet regulation to ward against the risk of regulatory overreach. And we've heard that how, like some states are themselves perpetrators of harm, and most of the time they issue petitions to the platform to take down content. So I fully agree with this approach, and that there's this concern of regulatory overreach when we start talking about lawful online harms, but at the same time, it could also be a missed opportunity. And in a way, the provocation is that this kind of regulation, like that wants to also regulate lawful online harms, could be this opportunity to expand these conceptualizations of online harms and go beyond dominant liberal legal frameworks. And it also could invite a range of different and proportionate remedies on the part of platforms, remedies that go beyond takedowns and user bans. And I'm motivated by three interrelated concerns to say this. The first is that there's a long recognized need for critical engagement with the underlying partiality of legal perspectives on harm. Like already in the 90s, critical risk scholar Mari Matsuda and colleagues, like they were saying that there is no view from nowhere when it comes to conceptualizing harm, and members of disadvantaged groups have not historically had their experiences and needs centered in the formulation of legal rules, which has resulted in a tendency also here in Europe, not only in the US, to dismiss cases of low-level abuse directed at historically marginalized groups, rather than appreciate how they contribute to cumulative harm. So it goes beyond harm that is a direct threat or incitement to a violence, but this low-level abuse, it's experienced composite and on aggregate. My second concern is the strong tendency for dominant legal frameworks of harm to center individual over structural factors in determining harm thresholds. So we know that power is not taken into account in platform policies, but these individualized harm frameworks minimize the risk related to wider societal harms, which are more than the sum of many individual harms. And the DSA like mentions societal harms like threats to democracy, and they've been like the concept, I think, that has been pretty much linked to misinformation, but there are also other societal harms that we observe on platforms like racism and sexism that also have this kind of content that contributes to this cumulative harm. And in this framework, also relying on overly individualized harm frameworks also misses the opportunity to address the ways in which these platforms' own design, policies, and processes may be complicit in creating and perpetuating harm. So what Eugenia was saying, that if we just focus on these individual notions of harm, then when we ask platforms to do like guidelines or risk assessments, they are not going to evaluate how their own systems perpetuate like societal harms, for instance, or contribute. And third, this focus on lawful harms and to just the need of expanding the conceptualization of lawful online harms is that we can't neglect the fact that platforms already go beyond what is required of them by law in their terms of service, but their policies often evolve in an ad hoc manner and with minimal references to the specific harms they are seeking to regulate. I mean, obviously some platforms have done consultations and they have like improved their policies, but we know little, or it's more difficult to really audit the way that they are enforcing these platforms. And platforms also implement remedies to online harms in more expansive ways than existing laws currently allow, by not only taking down, but also downranking and tagging and labeling content. But this process to remediate harm online, much of the time, these are lawful harms in a way, are done with minimum external oversight. So in a way, at their best, these procedural accountability frameworks, such as those seen in the UK's draft online safety bill, could incentivize platforms to more fully recognize and document the risk of harm occurrence offline, including those harms that occur cumulatively and at a societal level. And these process-based frameworks allow enough wiggle room, in a way, for dynamic and creative approaches to managing risk of harms at the time where I think that creativity in platform governance is really needed. And to this end, obviously regulators and platforms should listen to the needs and interests of those most impacted by online harms in order to redraw the definitional boundaries of what counts as harm and design proportionate and non-carceral responses to online harms. I mean, using non-carcerals to use what Ruha Benjamin uses in the new book, Viral Justice. So yeah, this is the provocation and that's it.
Thank you very much, Ariadna, for your provocation. We will go back to it later, I'm sure. Yong, is your, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Hey, thanks so much. Thanks, Paloma. I'm going to talk about a bit different tone, which means that instead of focusing on any particular country, I'm talking about the Netflix as part of the over the head, the over the top, the service platform, which means that I'm going to talk about platform governance in the Netflix era. The first thing we may need to talk about is what is the platform governance in relation to OTT platform and the social media platform. Platform governance that refers to laws, regulation, business practice, and the design decision that influence or control platform's content, operation, and the market access. Platform governance covers several areas, including international trade, including cultural trade, security, as you just talked about, social media content, competition policy, litigation, and the digitalization or digitization of money. These the areas cannot be done by the government alone. We are talking about the three major actors: government, platform companies, and the users. But I'm thinking that the platform the governance can be done by the international collaboration or by the international agencies. Therefore, I'm going to talk about this kind of the necessity with the case of the Netflix, of course, as well as the social media platform. Netflix is the global OTT platform to operate its function globally, not nationally. Therefore, it is necessary to control it through the global governance. Meaning, we have to think about how to resolve the information gap between the Netflix and the government. Netflix is everywhere in the more than 190 countries. Each country, each government deals with the Netflix, but the information they receive from their Netflix and the other OTT platforms is very marginal, very limited. Therefore, they cannot control Netflix and the social media platform properly. The information gap is crucial, and we have to deal with the information gap. Secondly, we have to think about how to apply the standard, local standard, regional standard, and the global standard to deal with the global OTT platforms in a few issues like their taxation and their legal issues. Most of all, platform governance is the international in nature. Therefore, we may need to talk about the major characteristics of digital platforms as their mediator. In this case, in my case, cultural production. Digital platforms have continued to become the major significant player. A platform refers to online services of their content intermediaries by the several, including the Indian case. But in my understanding, we have to understand the digital platforms as their mediator, not their intermediaries. Digital platforms must be treated as their mediators, not as their intermediaries. A platform is a mediator rather than an intermediary because it shapes the performance of social acts instead of merely facilitating this process. Platforms work not only as their conveyor or a distributor as value-neutral technologies, but also play a key role in manipulating and controlling the entire circle of their cultural industry. This particular nature or this particular characteristic of digital platforms as their mediator asks us to think about the platform governance as their global project, not the national or individual project. Another major issue in relation to digital the platforms, in particular Netflix, is whether the Netflix is a digital platform. In many cases, we simply consider social media platforms, including YouTube, Facebook, TikTok, as the digital platforms, but not the Netflix. In my understanding, however, due to several unique characteristics, data-driven, commercially oriented, and mediated, it is possible to define OTT platforms, including their Netflix, as their digital platforms, like their social media platforms. Digital platforms could be defined as large-scale online system premised on user interaction and user-generated content. Netflix, in this regard, is their on-demand video streaming platform. Netflix has transformed from a distribution channel to a production company to now digital platform. Netflix, in other words, Netflix reshapes the global cultural markets. The global users, and therefore the global users. Digital platforms, including Netflix, are global, and the process of globalization has been the fastest. In cultural production, OTT platforms have transformed the ecology of global entertainment markets. The rise of their digital media platforms is challenging the supremacy of television and the movie theaters as major entertainment centers. For Netflix, digital generations who are used to working and playing with digital technologies are the major consumers. Netflix is the representation, therefore, of the platform imperialism in the global cultural markets. Again, from content distribution to exhibition to production, Netflix has shifted the ecology of global cultural industries. Netflix's global dominance can be particularly seen in this particular COVID-19 era, and it determines how Netflix constructs platform imperialism. Netflix promotes imperialism, which expands asymmetrical power relations between the United States and other parts of the global society, which means that there are some gaps, information gaps between Netflix and other countries. Secondly, there are some information gaps between the United States and the other countries. Therefore, we have to work together to control and manage the Netflix and other OTT platforms through global governance. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. Netflix imperialism. I'm gonna write that down. I'm gonna give the floor to Pranav, who's gonna moderate the conversation. So Pranav, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paloma. Thanks everyone who's spoken so far. I think a lot of really interesting and relevant points came out during your individual presentations, but something that I think was very key to the overall thing that connects everyone's presentations was how different jurisdictions deal with platform governance in different ways. So rising from a point Tomiwa mentioned about the first two presentations and how there were differences. Why do you think the differences in approach between the global north and the global south exist with respect to platform governance? Does anyone have ideas on factors that exist, like the laws in place or the spending power of the user base, that show a strong causal link between why the approach is different in different jurisdictions. So I think if any of the speakers have points on this, I think it would be very useful for the discussion. Yeah, Eugenia, please.
Yeah, just to say that I don't think that there are. I think there are some differences for sure in terms of like the relative power of the state, and also perhaps the interest of the state in countries outside the global north. But I don't think that there is any fundamental difference in terms of how platforms are understood. So I think that that in general, both in the EU and the United States, for example, platforms are seen as relatively neutral, kind of like tech corporations, and like the potential harms are basically like externalities that the platforms don't control or don't or have nothing very much to do with. So I think that there are a lot of similarities as well. So it's not all differences. I think that the differences are in terms of what each nation state, I suppose, considers its interests and how it moves to protect them. And of course, in countries that have authoritarian tendencies, the differences are exacerbated. But I think that if we focus at the level of how they define, how nations in their policy instruments define and understand platforms and users and their own role, I think that this is not necessarily antithetical or very different.
Thank you, Eugenia. Yeah, that's a very valid point. Does anyone else want to add?
In terms of the jurisdiction of each country, again, digital platforms, in particular social media platforms and OTT platforms, are global in nature. So therefore, some the platforms like the Facebook, TikTok, YouTube, the Netflix, they are all the American, meaning the global north platforms. Therefore, the dominant power of the Western or the global north is the continuing, which means that instead of the making individual and the kind of therefore small kind of the regulation, we have to work together, meaning the EU or the Oceania or ASEAN kind of the regional entities work together to deal with those big power. Therefore, they can make their kind of their progress.
Thank you, Divyansha. Divyansha, do you want to go on this?
Yeah, I do want to say that while there are similarities across the types of problems that we face across the globe, I do think there are specific context, specific items that do tend to come up in global South contexts. For example, in India, you would have problems that these companies have not faced before. So we have histories of cost-based discriminations that it took years for platforms to even recognize as a thing to have in their reporting forms. I'm not sure all of them do currently still. There are local issues that do need to be dealt with, and I'm not entirely sure that giving that away, power to the governments themselves, might be a complete answer. We do sort of need to have some co-governance mechanisms. There are studies around how communities themselves have tried to set their own rules. So like self-regulation, self-governance of specific platforms themselves in smaller communities has been shown to work, but is, yeah, still all open questions, I would say.
Yes, please, Ariadna.
No, maybe another difference, but it's a bit different what we are discussing, but sometimes when we think about these regulations, that we have some platforms in mind. And I think what also differs depending on the geographical region is the main platforms that people use. And I know that here in Australia, all the regulations around misinformation are disregarding all messaging apps. And messaging apps are really important in other parts of the world, starting in Brazil, in a lot of Latin American countries, and Southeast Asia. So, and they pose particular questions from Telegram to WhatsApp. So I think that sometimes also the platform specificity when we think about this big regulation is important, because even though in the case of WhatsApp, we can think about, oh, this is private messaging, it's not the same. In some countries, it's used as public because some groups are circulated in the open web and they become like semi like public spaces too. So maybe that's another thing to bear in mind when we looked at these regulations and how to define societal harms of these technologies.
All right. Tomiwa, would you like to give closing comments?
So yes, quickly, I also think some of the things that, some of the factors that account for the, because in my view, I think that there are more differences than there are similarities. And I think what accounts for most of the similarities is primarily, in terms of interest, in terms of pressure. There seems to be more pressure, especially from many actors, including the government, in the global north compared to the global south. What you would find most times in the global south is usually civil society are clamoring for things to be done properly. And most times you find government in bed or in cahoots with, most of these social media platforms. So oftentimes you discover that the pressure levels in each region is different. Another thing is that there is this, neo-colonial fault lines that I think many of us miss. Neo-colonial fault lines in our laws, in how our systems are perceived, in how many social media platforms engage with our, activities and, major political events. And I reference this by saying that for a fact, a company, for example, like Meta, will not treat UK elections or US elections like the way it's going to treat Gabonese elections. So it's going to pay more attention for some reasons to those bigger, in quotes, democracies compared to elections in places in African countries. Also, there is also, in my view, the challenge of context, which goes as far as automated decision making, machines that don't understand context, hires that do not understand context, language, linguistics requirement. So you discover that most of the time, platforms just want to focus on the Arabic, the French, the Portuguese, and the English. There is the Swahili, there is the Bantu, there's so many local languages, there's the Hindu, there's so many local languages that has been spoken in the global south, but which, many platforms do not think that they, they should also equal, resources should also be devoted to those languages to, also in order to be able to carry out governance, platform governance properly in Global South context. So in my view, just over the top of my head, I think these are some of the factors that are affecting, the differences between how we're seeing platform governance in each of these regions. Thank you.
Thank you, Tomiwa. Thanks, everyone, for yeah, Paloma, please go.
So I'm still not that convinced that there is such a difference, in the sense that I very much can observe how in Europe governments are linked with social media platforms, our regulations, and the way, just picking up on what Eugenia was bringing up before, the Digital Act does not transform or alter. Very much, I think the entire similarity that I have been hearing in all presentations is that in the context of platform governance, platforms are the ones that govern. And picking up again on what Ariadna was bringing up, they are adopting certain international liberal values and implementing those liberal values as a form of imperialism everywhere, in every single region. And some of them are affecting directly minorities, rather in the Global South or in Europe too. So it's interesting how we are already framing as a difference when the reality, or what I observe is that there are more similarities, in the sense of platforms are governing, all we are doing is encountering those tensions, but it also affects the same group, which are minorities or historically oppressed groups on our context. So I don't know, I would love to hear more about it. Thank you.
Eugenia?
Yeah, I suppose I work with Paloma, so we tend to agree. But this is how I would locate platform governance as well, because I think that the important problems that to me were mentioned in terms of like local kind of like contextual understanding is crucial. But from the point of view of platforms, this is kind of like an operational problem. It's not an ideological difference. It's just like, okay, yeah, we'll come to that when the time comes. And also speaking from a country that nominally belongs to the global north, Greece, but in actual fact, it's a marginalized kind of country with a minority language. We also have the same problems of like having proper kind of like teams understanding contents and offering content moderation that is sensitive to context. But I don't think that this is necessarily of the same order, a problem of the same order as, for example, the issue of content moderation being done on the basis of liberal values, which is something that I would see as what is involved in this kind of like platform colonialism part, that they impose this same kind of understanding across the world, although not in the way that Yong spoke about, like the need for a global platform governance. There is a kind of like a global platform governance by default. It's just dictated by platforms themselves. I also wanted to follow up on a comment by Divyansha, which I think is very important, this idea of co-regulation, because ultimately the DSA is an example of co-regulation. But to me, it's an example of co-regulation that prioritizes the interests and the power of platforms, because you have co-regulation, like not all parties are equal. And those who invest a lot of power and a lot of resources, even from civil society, they will end up kind of like influencing these models, and users, like the ones that Tomiwa referred to, are still going to be the ones without a voice. So, and this from this point of view, maybe the state, not the actual state, but an idealized state that represents all of the citizens, should be there to protect these minorities. But in practice, of course, we know that it doesn't happen.
Paloma?
Although I would like to ask Tomiwa if you could actually delve or explain further what did you mean about how colonial laws are being adopted by platforms. Is there any example you have in mind that illustrates this point? I think it's really right. So colonial laws are being adopted by platforms. Is there any specific that you can pick up today?
Sorry, Paloma, can you kindly repeat the question?
Sure. You brought up before, I found that extremely interesting. Colonial laws are being adopted by platforms. Do you have any specific example in mind to illustrate this point?
Oh, okay. So thank you. For example, let me use the Cybercrimes Act of 2015 in Nigeria as an example. Section 24, I think subsection 1, criminalizes insults shared through computer networks. And I think by 3 years and a couple of $1,000s. Now, the way this this provision has been used in the past is usually wielded by highly placed individuals like politicians, wealthy businessmen, to clamp down on journalists and social justice campaigners that they do not like, and sometimes litigate them to death, with death, the right word to use, not to death, but to use those laws to harass them. At the end of the day, I mean, in a couple of cases that I've seen, those laws are not, sometimes they end up in court, but at the end of the day, they are not properly, they don't usually go through the process of the court to have the court determine maybe on the propriety of the provision or the constitutionality of the provision. Usually those provisions are used to harass, and at the end of the day, what you see is to ask maybe that journalist or that individual to tender a public apology. Now, the colonial relevance of that is that this was how criminal codes and penal codes that were in use in the colonial era in Nigeria and other African countries were used to clamp down on locals. So you have provisions of laws that also criminalize insults against the state, against the religion. In fact, you have other problematic legal provisions like sedition, like publication of false news that were in those old laws, but have now found their ways into laws like the Cybercrime Act that I've explained earlier. So you see like a tapestry, a narrative, a straight line between those laws, those old laws and the new ones. And the interesting thing about this is that the provisions on provisions under these new laws are similar across the region. Similar across the region in the sense that the same law exists in Uganda, it exists in Nigeria, it exists in Malawi, it exists in Kenya. So, and these also are major former British colonies that also adopted the same colonial laws from the 1890s as it was, adopted then in Sudan, and I've forgotten the other, and in Ghana. So you find out that, these laws have, did not stop at just during the colonial era. The colonial, government handed power out to political elites that are most of them are still in power today and continue to use that colonial dynamic to, come up with laws to regulate not just the offline space, but also the online space. So that is what I mean by the colonial influence or the social media platforms this is the way the social media platforms coming in the use of the laws is that when you speak to social media platforms on their relationship with the state, they tell you that their policy requires them to apply national laws. And the laws I've just described to you are the laws social media platforms are using. So that is why I said that social media platforms and governments are in one way or the other asphyxiating the average African user by, but maybe, on the part of the social media platforms, it's a compliance or regulatory issue for them to want to kowtow to these laws. But I am, for a fact explaining that these laws are patently problematic, and these are the laws that social media platforms want to work with. So that is what I mean when I said both actors are using legal means, using, in quotes, legal means to, suppress, or to want to govern. They want to use legal means as a basis for platform governance, but this legal means is quite problematic. Government also use extra legal means sometimes. By backdoor government requests that are not backed by law and all of that, which is why one of the clamor for is that social media platforms should also get more transparent on what these requests are from the government. So I hope that sheds some light in describing the dynamics between social media platforms, governments, colonialism, and the laws being used in that context. I'm happy to explain more if you need me to. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tomiwa. Very interesting. And just one more question, if it's okay. That would result in content in insults taken down from social media platforms, or in the government using the digital space to pick up on those that are offending them, or they are insulting them, or persecute them. I don't.
Sorry, I'm a little bit confused. Kindly rephrase, please.
So there is something that is clear to me, is that governments will be using those social media platforms will be taking down content that insults. So social media platforms will be taking down insults on the region, or if it's rather than the government is using the social media space to persecute those that are insulting.
I think it is both ways. I think it is both ways in the sense that social media platforms, like I said earlier, always, according to them, they say they are beholden to national laws. And, also government, also on the other side, private individuals, private high-handed political individuals also then use so the government does not only use the law against its citizens when it approaches social media platforms also based maybe to make a request for a particular content. It is this same set of laws that it cites to the social media platforms. So, and like I said, social media platforms are beholden to these laws and in some way to the government. Because on the long run, what that means oftentimes is that social media platforms end up throwing the average African user under the bus. And this has happened over time. And the reason why social media platforms end up doing that is because when they do not honor, in quotes, government requests, governments then begin to use extra legal means, for example, like asking internet service providers to limit a particular, like what you see in Nigeria. So, yeah. And also in Uganda, because during the elections in 2021, the Facebook are taking down some pro-government accounts that were sharing propaganda. And as a reprisal for that, the Ugandan government requested its telecommunication regulator to order ISPs to block Facebook. And for months, Facebook was blocked. In another instance, Facebook could have easily, if it was an issue of a particular government request made to it, it might make a business decision to say that I would rather honor a request to remove a content of 2 individuals rather than wait for the government to block our platform in Uganda. I don't know if that makes sense to you the way I'm explaining, but I'm just trying to paint a picture of what currently obtains in the region, which is quite problematic, and explains the platform governance powers that is usually just oscillating between just two actors, the government and the social media platforms. The average African user rarely ever features. So, yeah.
Thank you, Tomiwa. Thanks, Amelia.
Thanks, everyone. So do we, Paloma, do we have time for more questions? I noticed there are, I think we have like 3 minutes left.
I don't know if I am just kidding. Yeah, I will suggest now if any of the participants wants to throw just to write down the chat any question, any of the members of the audience, if there is any question for any of the speakers, or the chat is available for everybody. Otherwise, if any of the panelists wants to make any additional comments. We still have 3 minutes.
Or, I mean, if any panelist wants to respond to another panelist's provocations or points they raised, that would be very interesting also.
I mean, we don't have a lot of time, but what I would say is that because I think that one of the interesting about these new regulations is that it will open the door to be more creative in the way that platform governance is being done. And I was wondering whether you have some ideas about it, to end in a more positive vibe about things that could be done to improve it. And yeah, I just wanted to know from your local context, if you have some consultations going on or things that you can see a bit of, yeah, especially, I mean, not that much. I mean, it could be also with online harms in the legal sense, but I'm really interested in all these regulation that platforms do with what it's not really reaching criminal thresholds, and these are the lawful online harms, and all the enforcement of these rules is even more opaque than what they do with the legal harm. So I was wondering whether you have any thoughts about this, the panelists, but also people in the audience, that I'm sure that some of you do research on platform governance.
Just a quick response to you, Ariadna, which is, I don't know if it's a positive vibe, but it's an interesting one, I think that a lot of what is going on will be challenged in courts. I think that for me, one of the most kind of significant developments was the challenge against Meta by the Rohingya communities. I think that when we start holding accountable platforms in terms of actually compensating for harms they have caused, then maybe we'll start seeing some more interesting things happening. But at the moment, I don't see this as a formal requirement, but I see that the courts have the power to enforce this. And then the courts, the people who take platforms to courts are coming from civil society. So I think this is a very interesting space, and for sure there will be developments in the near future.
I mean, in India, there's challenges coming actually from Twitter to some of the confidentiality of the court orders that I'd mentioned earlier, and on the contents of the items that they were asked to take down. So there are developments coming in this space where we will be able to see whether some of this stuff holds up in court or not.
So one thing that I would like to talk about is that I think that's right. We have to ask the social media platform, OTT platforms, to pay some harms done, but we have to also ask them to share their profits, their revenues, their the information Therefore, for example, they make a lot of money through the increasing number of their users. Therefore, they must use their money to develop their kind of their society community. Therefore, not only asking them to pay some their harms done, but also ask them to share their kind of their revenue profits.
Yeah, I think these are very interesting points about how, especially about how judicial reform can happen from either side for both platforms that overstep and governments that overregulate. But yeah, if there aren't any questions in chat or then maybe we can move into closing comments. Paloma, what do you think?
I haven't seen any question on the chat, so if there is room for closing comments, Pranav, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you everyone for making it and for all the participants to stick around. I think this is today's last session, if I'm not wrong. So thank you, everyone. Thanks to all the panelists and Paloma for moderating. It was great to be the discussant in the session, and a lot of the comments here and a lot of the presentations have taught me a lot and given me new perspectives on how to think about platform governance going forward in the future. So I hope the participants also like this presentation, and yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks very much. Bye now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.